Football is one of America's favorite sports. Millions of viewers watch their favorite team compete every week. Recently, there has been some controversy over the safety of the game. Many players have been suffering from concussions, and retired players are noticing the long-term effects. In order to understand what goes on during a concussion, you'll first need a background on the way the brain works. The brain is made up of three major sections: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is divided into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe is responsible for awareness, behavior, problem-solving, speech, and movement. The parietal lobe helps with perception, interpretation of language, and our senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The occipital lobe helps us interpret specific visual cues, such as movement and color. And finally, the temporal lobe is for memory and comprehension. The outside layer of the cerebrum is called the cortex, and it is made up of billions of cells called neurons. These neurons produce neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that travel to other parts of the brain to communicate important information. Below the cerebrum is the cerebellum, which is responsible for balance and controlling muscle movements. Finally, the brainstem controls many of the body's involuntary actions, such as breathing, blinking, sleep cycles, and heart rate. So now that you understand a little bit of the brain's anatomy, I'm going to explain what happens to the brain during a concussion. On average, there are around 130 plays during the course of a professional football game. In this time, players are very susceptible to receiving a concussion. According to the NFL, about 1/3 of concussions are caused by contact between 2 players' helmets. Players either hit each other head-on or they are hit from the side. This second example is far more dangerous, and I will be using our brain diagram to explain why. Alright, so surrounding the brain is a thin layer of liquid called cerebrospinal fluid. Because the brain is not attached to the skull, this fluid acts as a protection layer between the brain and the skull. A helmet cannot provide all of the protection the brain needs because the brain is actually floating in the fluid. When a player is hit from the front, the brain will begin shaking back and forth. When a player is hit from the side, the brain will actually rotate back and forth, not only hitting the sides of the skull, but also pulling and stretching the nerve fibers of the brain. Some fibers get stretched to the point where their neurons are damaged, but others may actually snap. This causes several small hemorrhages to occur at the site of these breaks. If this blood leaks into the brain, it could potentially damage neurons. During this movement, neurotransmitters are released, but are unable to communicate information because the event is so shocking to the brain. At the same time, sodium and potassium ions begin to flow out of the brain's neuron cells and into the cerebrospinal fluid. Calcium then flows back into the neuron, essentially paralyzing the cell. This means that the cell can no longer communicate the information it is supposed to provide the rest of the brain. When cell death like this occurs, parts of the temporal lobe, where again memory and language are processed, are no longer able to function properly. Quite often, these types of concussions are not just one-time occurrences, but happen many times over the course of an athlete's career. This ongoing damage to the brain is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. A person who suffers from CTE will face deteriorating brain mass, memory loss, impulsive behavior, and depression, among various other issues. Currently, CTE has only been diagnosed after death through autopsies. However, scientists are working on finding ways to identify the condition in living individuals. The NFL has taken some steps to reduce the potential for concussions, such as penalizations for players who tackle head first. However, greater steps need to be taken to protect as well as inform athletes about the potential life-altering risks of the game.